and welcome to another week of WyoToday Sports Live. This is Kevin Shields along with Cody and Baylor Beers. How's it going, fellas?
Going well. Of course, you had a big game last night. We've got a bunch of games tonight across the network, and we're pretty excited as Riverton and Buffalo, Lander and Douglas, Thermopolis, and help me out here. Who they playing?
That's a good question. I need to look that up.
But
hold, I'll pull that up. I'm pulling up volleyball scores at the same time.
It's 1 week before the Riverton and Lander games, Kevin, and both of these teams looking for wins tonight. Douglas comes in maybe a little bit hot under the collar after losing to Riverton last week. Takes on the Tigers tonight. Buffalo 1-0 in conference play. Beat Rollins 61-0 last week. Comes in for homecoming.
Thermopolis, that is I think the only battle of ranked on ranked for us tonight, and that is on KD&O. Join us on 101.7. This network right here, it's an early start. It's at 2 p.m. today, and it's number 3 Thermopolis traveling to number 5 Cokeville.
That's a long trip.
Wow. It's a long trip, and they had to leave early, obviously, with the 2 p.m. kickoff.
Probably on the road right now.
It would not surprise me if also Ryan and Kevin are on their way to bring you all the action. That will, again, be at 2 o'clock. Look for this pregame show, probably about 1:30. I'm going to jump here. Kind of a... I don't want to say weak. That's a bad word. But a light schedule as far as sports go so far this week. And she's
Trivia for you, Kevin. What's Cokeville's mascot?
I have no idea, but hold on.
Is a panther better than a bobcat? Can a panther beat a bobcat? And we're not on the air. Are we on the air?
That's what we're trying to find out. But we are on the stream, so we'll just keep going.
Is a panther stronger than a bobcat? We're going to find that out tonight. The Cokeville Panthers and the Thermopolis Bobcats.
In a literal sense, a panther is slightly larger than a bobcat, I'd say. A little more sneaky, but I think in a figurative sense, a bobcat is a much more menacing mascot than a panther. I mean, just look at the Carolina Panthers.
Y'all keep debating that for a second.
Well, the Bobcats were purple. But anyway, big game tonight. Riverton hosting Buffalo, and Baylor, both of these teams 1-0 in conference play, and Mark Lenhart was very adamant about it last week. All that Douglas win meant was that Riverton's 1-0 in conference play.
Well, there's still 4 more conference games to go, and anything can happen. I mean, we're seeing Lander put up a really good season. I mean, we're going to know a lot, I think, after tonight's game, Lander playing Douglas. Kind of the power rankings of not the AFC, the 3A East Conference. But Riverton still has 4 games to play. They're playing Buffalo, who just come off, like you said, they came off a great win against Rollins. And so, you still got to show up and play. And then, I mean, obviously, it's the greatest curse you can have as a football team is looking past your next opponent, because anybody can beat anybody. I mean, it's kind of a college saying, any given Saturday, anybody can win. And so it's the same way with high school. You make silly mistakes, you don't play up to your abilities, and then suddenly you're 1-1. So it's every game from here on out is just as important as that Douglas game.
Well, the Lander Tigers had to bring Braden Baker out of last Friday's game with a knee injury. He had packed the ball like 8 times for 130 yards. They brought in a kid named Cody West, who then reeled off 190 yards rushing in that win for Lander. So you got to think that Lander is a little bit deeper than everybody thought they were. And because of that rushing game, they only threw for 47 yards through the air. So, I'm not looking ahead, but it's fun to think ahead and think this game in Lander next week is going to be one of the marquee matchups of the season.
Well, as long as you're a fan or broadcaster doing that, that's great. You can't look ahead, though, if you're the players. And we're going to jump right into real quick. Like I said, light schedule, really, just volleyball and football this week.
Swimming,
Riverton
too.
On the docket for this weekend, but not yet. So in volleyball action, Riverton defeated Natrona County. Big win for them, 3-0. Lander got back somewhat to their winning ways. They defeated Rawlins 3-2. Scrolling through here, I'm kind of out of breath from running up and down the stairs.
I want to get some exercise there,
Yeah,
boss.
no kidding. Unfortunately, Riverton fell last night to Rock Springs, down in Rock Springs, 3-1. And Shoshone did defeat Wind River in volleyball as well, 3-0 last night.
Big win by the Wranglers on the gridiron.
Indeed, we're about to jump right into that one. Boy, what a game. They say in like UFC, mixed martial arts, boxing, styles make fights. And that's what you generally get when Trumpler and Frederick tee off against each other. Shoshone, a little more of a balanced attack. They want to run and throw the ball, but explosive play is definitely a part of their arsenal versus Wind River, who came into this game with about 1.7 completions per game. Now, that's not as awful as it sounds because they only throw the ball usually 3-4 times tops. They want to set up that wing tee. They want to get behind Ben Snyder and, of course, Jeffrey Bubba Rushing. And they want to.
Is his last name really Rushing?
Yes.
Or did he change it because he runs the football?
It's actually his last name.
All
It's
right.
apropos.
Bubba. Go Bubba.
He's built like a fire hydrant, guys. I mean, he's just stocky, big, fast. He is an absolute bruiser, and they want to body blow you into submission.
Does he eat ribs? Does he eat ribs, brisket,
I don't know.
barbecued chicken?
I have no
You got
idea.
it when your name's Bubba.
He's got to consume some calories though, because boy, they just about rode on his back all the way back to Pavilion. He had 41 carries, 205 yards in the losing effort as Shoshone wins 28-22. On paper, of course, a lot of people in the stands thought that Shoshone was going to come out and just kind of win easily because Wind River, just like last year, started 0-3. Got a get-right game against Wyoming Indian to go to 1-3, but it's back-to-back seasons where Wind River's played such high-level competition those first 3 weeks that when they match it with Shoshone, it's just a potential for a classic. And Wind River won the opening kickoff, took the ball, which myself and Marshall in the booth thought was the smart thing to do, establish that run early and often. Went down the field, 8 running plays in a row, and then pulled a fast one that no one was expecting and threw a 30-yard pass to Kai Alatini from Tanner Walker, and of course converted for 2. Shoshone struggled in the first quarter, had a hard time really getting their offense going, but their defense was able to hold enough, and you kind of had a little back and forth, no one really putting a stamp on it, a couple scores. And then the explosive plays happened towards the end of the second quarter and the beginning of the third. In the second, Caden Kissling found his brother Carson on a 91-yard bomb. Now, Caden, you owe your brother lunch today because it was about a 15-yard pass. Carson Kissling made a couple guys, one guy really miss, and then was just gone off to the races, put distance between them, and that gave them a 1-score lead. Then coming right out of it, they were able to kind of 2-for-1 it, even though Wind River had the ball at the end of the second half, end of the first half. Carson Kissling receives the kickoff about the 15, goes 85, and gives them the lead. Then a little more back and forth action, and really it was. Wind River never really abandoned, never even went away from their attack, even with the clock rolling and whatnot. They were able to get it to 28-22, in part because Colby Brink had missed a PAT. I couldn't tell from the booth whether it was bad hold, bad snap, what have you. But they missed the PAT, and then Shoshone gets the ball about 5 minutes left. They're going to want to try and run balance, but also run the ball a little bit, get the clock moving and ice this thing out. Great play by the Wind River front 3. They were able to get in the backfield, get the guy down, but as they spun him, ball comes flying out. They recover inside the 50, inside Wrangler territory. They get all the way to the 6, and then two things happened. One is a false start, which moved them back to 11. They got down to about the 4, handed it Jeffrey Rushing his 41st carry of the day, and somehow Shoshone, which prides itself on gang tackling, and it had struggled against Jeffrey Rushing, was able to tackle him down about the 1.5 yards. They were out of timeouts. They tried to get up. Tanner Walker attempted to spike it. Wouldn't have mattered because it was 4th down, but was unable to get the playoff, and that was how it ended. But super crowd last night. There's a reason it's the best small school rivalry in the state, in my opinion.
I think cross-county rivalries are always fun. And, it's kind of like in the NFL we saw last night, the 49ers, I would say, upset the Rams at home. And it's like the lines don't matter. Which team is better don't matter in rivalry games, because anything can happen. We see that with CSU, Wyoming. We see that with everything. And so, it sounds like it was a really fun game to be at, really exciting. And I know for the players, it was probably fun because it's kind of unique in Fremont County because probably the kids you're playing against, Shoshone kids playing against Wind River kids, those kids are probably people they hang out with, after school.
Oh, yeah. They know everybody
the
from the
or
fair.
Go to fair
together. Or
everything of that
Eat
nature.
ribs with Bubba.
It was a real... It was a barn burner, and like you said, you throw it out last year. Everybody who looks at it, I think even Coach Frederick would admit, the wing tee's not built to come back at all. They get down 3 scores last year, and somehow they run off 4 unanswered scores to take the lead and eventually won that game at home. It's so in the 3 years I've had a chance to call them, this is back-to-back classics between the two. Mm-hmm. Now, granted, 3 years ago, 3 seasons ago was Wind River's run to the state runner-up. That one wasn't as close, but the past 2 years have been really fun to watch. And again, they're correct. Styles make fights, and it was fun to watch and very interesting to watch because usually in that kind of thing, one style beats out the other one as far as just dictating tempo, but both of them were able to run their offense and run a couple of trick type things. But Carson Kissling was our player of the game. And the 2 explosive plays. At the end of the day, the explosive plays beat the body blows. The clock really came into matter. I don't know what you do there. They had to use their 3 timeouts when they used their 3 timeouts, and they just... Let's put it this way. Jeffrey Rushing getting the ball in the last play didn't fool anybody, and I don't think it was meant to. I think it was kind of like old Nebraska Cornhusker in the mid-'90s and early '90s and late '80s with Tom Osborne, where it's, here's what we're going to do, stop it, and credit the Shoshone defense. They made the last stop that they had to.
Well, in these rivalry games, and there's a lot of rival games that are fun around the state, small school rivals, Wind River Shoshone's always one of the best. They play the game on Thursday night for a reason, because they get to showcase both programs on a Thursday night for Fremont County. And, you win that game, it makes your year. Everything else is frosting on the cake. You lose that game and you scratch your heads, and then you try to win a game down the road so you can forget about that game. That's what rivalry games are so special about is just that feeling that, hey, 20 years ago, we beat you guys on Thursday night. And that's cool stuff, especially you're probably farming together. You're meeting at the place where you dump your sugar beets. You meet at Fast Lane for coffee, or you meet for breakfast at the trailhead. You still talk about that game, especially if you win. I'll use a comparison back to Little League days when I was coaching. There was a city championship game here, and my son's team was fortunate enough to make all the plays and win the game. They still point that out to their buddies, 20 years later. It's fun stuff.
Absolutely.
When Georgia eventually beats Alabama, those guys will remember that day.
Well, we did for a national title, so
it's the same thing, Kevin. But it's the same thing. Those are the games you remember.
And the interesting part is they wanted to put this game on Friday. It was originally scheduled for tonight, but an officials issue, which has been a long-running kind of problem, not just in Wyoming but everywhere.
Well, it was a problem last week as Green River and Evanston had to play on Saturday.
Yeah.
Because of officials.
So it's just a lack of officials. So if anybody's interested out there, of course the AD at Shoshone Mason's got a couple of games where he's an official this weekend.
But WyoToday was there, and good job.
Yeah, it was an absolute ball. We did have one other matchup in Fremont County last night. Number 4 Rocky Mountain hosted Wyoming Indian. Yeah, it ended 77-0 in favor of Rocky Mountain. Rocky Mountain had 4 pick sixes in that game. Tough matchup for the Chiefs. Of course, going to number 4 Rocky Mountain. And it doesn't get any easier for them. It gets a little closer to home as next week, one of our games of the week, we got a doubleheader. We'll start out at 2 o'clock with Du Bois hosting Encampment. And then we've got Wyoming Indian hosting Shoshone at 6 in Ethity.
All right.
So it doesn't get any easier for them. For Du Bois, I don't know how good Encampment is. It really doesn't matter. For them, at least mentally, it will get a little easier because Saturday, Du Bois has to go to the place that their season ended last year in the playoffs. And it was a murder. I mean, and it's a program that we all know is dominant, and they've got to go to Little Snake River.
I just wanted to bring up a kid with local ties who's the tailback this year with the Jackson team. Cooper Kinsler is the tailback for Jackson. They had a tough loss last week in Star Valley. So been watching him. He shows up on the Wild Prep stats, doing a nice job for Jackson. But it'll be interesting to see how Jackson does the rest of the year. And so if you want to watch at least the stats of a kid with local roots, Cooper Kinsler's over there in Jackson and doing a decent job. He's in the top 10 rushing stats for Class 3A. But, give it a look. Give it a look.
Now, this is going to be an odd transition, probably a little tougher for Baylor before we get in our fancy moment here. I would be remiss if I did not mention that this past Saturday, the 27th, number 64 for Shoshone's JV team, Gavin Ray Knigge, passed away in a car accident. He's the son of Jason Knigge and Shadell Mullen of Riverton. Our condolences go out to him. They honored him last night with his jersey on the hanging off the deck. And it was it was an emotional moment for Shoshone last night. There is a celebration of life. I think it's at 11, but don't hold me to it. I announced
Today?
it last night. No, on Sunday.
Okay.
It's at the Shoshone High School Gymnasium. So they lost one of their own this past Saturday. So our condolences go out to the entire Shoshone family and, of course, his parents and immediate family as well. This would normally be, if we had commercials for this, where I'd segue that. So we'll go ahead and talk about Porter's, who's sponsoring our show here. Sponsors WyoToday Newsroom as well. So I don't know about you guys. I notice it's less here. I get it because winter hits. But this is the time where, my SEC roots, so to speak, we're smoking meats and sitting outside by the fire pit and stuff like that. I know it happens here. Pull a TV outside, stretch a coaxial cable for 150 yards if necessary and watch some cowboy football or whatever team you root for. So go by and see them. Not only do they have obviously hot tubs, smokers, grills, great products like that, they also have this great little area off to their left with all sorts of rubs and seasonings and marinades, and boy, are they delicious.
Yeah, they do a great job down there at Porter's, but my thoughts and prayers out to the Knigge family. It's nobody should have to bury a child.
No, and
what a gut wrencher that is. I mean, we can have all the fun we want here on this program, but in the end, their son's gone.
Yeah.
So, thoughts and prayers to the family.
So Baylor, we're going to transition now. It's fantasy football. I'm 3-1, and I still don't know how. It did look like finally Genty from Boise State decided to wake up and have himself a game, which helped me win. But so we're about quarter of the way, or quarter to a third, depending on how long the season plays out, depending on your league through the season.
Yeah, you're talking about Genty. I mean, when the season starts, obviously players trend one way or the other. You're expecting A.J. Brown to have 100 yards receiving every game, or Ashton Genty obviously to run that offense, and then they struggle. Those are really good players that are in a good situation that would be really good trade for targets. Like, you want to go out and get those players because they're going to return to excellent play, which we saw with A.J. Brown, and then obviously last week he kind of went back to nothing. And I think he'll get there. I just think the Eagles, they are happy to win, putting up 100 total yards of offense at the moment. I mean, but
just win, baby, just win.
Yeah. They're not going to be able to continue to do that. But it's important to look at those players, and especially if your other league mates, if they're out on a player, you probably can get a pretty good deal on somebody like Ashton Genty. I was trying pretty hard to get him in the Dynasty League. And, I mean, I was offering, pennies on the dollar of what he was worth at the beginning of the season. So, I mean, just keep an eye on that. And then also, if you have a player who you think, is going to struggle the rest of the year, like Chase Brown or someone like that, when they have a good game and they kind of return back to that average from last year, you might want to try to go out and get something for them when their value is the highest, and that's kind of what the moves you can make to strengthen your team and put you in a better position as the season goes on.
Well, and I had to cut Tyreek Hill in my dynasty league, my keeper league, and drafted him decently high. But, of course, he's out for the season. He may never be the same again. Yeah. Originally thought dislocated knee. People sometimes don't understand. They think dislocated knee can lead to it's a much higher percentage than any other injury to lead to even amputation because of an artery hidden back in there. But of course, on Monday or Tuesday, he also found out he'd obliterated all the ligaments as well. So,
that's the danger with a dislocated knee is it's not like a shoulder where they just pop it back in.
Yeah.
It's him and then Najee Harris last week tore his Achilles, and. Man, I just don't know how those two guys really come back. I mean, those might be career enders for those two guys.
A lot of injuries happening. And we saw John Gruden go off on injuries this past week. But
I didn't.
Of course,
I couldn't care less what he says.
Well, I know y'all talked about the games tonight a little bit. So let's kind of jump ahead as we're running a little tight on time. Of course, we got huge games tonight on Friday Night Lights. Riverton hosting Buffalo in homecoming. It'll be the first game I get to go to, so that'll be fun. Watch my son and whatnot.
1:30 p.m. homecoming parade, by the way, down Riverton's Main Street.
We're trying to explore options as far as filming it. Usually we'd get up on our roof. We're missing some of the guys who help because it's kind of a swing and it's hard to do. So we may not be able to get it on film. We've gotten a couple years here and there, so we're gonna see what we can do as far as that goes. Of course, that will be here in downtown. And a reminder, unlike I think every other parade, they go the opposite direction. So if you're coming from Federal, they'll be on the right because they go up the hill towards the school versus down the hill like the other parade. So just a little bit of change if you're a first-time parent with a band kid or want to come to kids on a float or something like that, that your best bet is on the opposite side from us on Main Street. So we'll jump real quick. Any thoughts? Big homecoming game tomorrow in Laramie for the Pokes as they'll host undefeated 4-0 UNLV running Rebs with Dan Mullen, of course, and he's looking like a pretty good hire for them.
Well, the Rebels are giving up big yards defensively through the air and running. They really haven't played anyone yet, but like you told me before we went on, they are 4-0. You're going to give him more credit than we're going to give him because he's from the Southeast.
Oh, he's from Florida. I hate Dan Mullen.
No, you love him. But anyway, the Cowboys have had a bye week. The UNLV Rebs have had a bye week. This is a big game. Wyoming needs to continue to improve. They've got to unleash the offense at some point, but yet they've got to find a way to slow UNLV's offense. Could be a good game. I think it'll go down to the fourth quarter. It's going to be a close game, probably somewhere in the high 20s for each team. And, eternal optimist here. Go Pokes.
I think, UNLV is kind of, they're 4-0. I mean, 4-0 is obviously a great accomplishment. Any D1 school, beating any D1 school is difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. That's why they get paid millions of dollars to coach teams. But, it's kind of like, I think the Wyoming last year when they played UConn and NIU on the road and squeaked out a win and were 4-0 after conference play. Was that last year? A couple years ago. But it was like everyone kind of knew that Pokes team wasn't as strong as they were on paper, and that's kind of where the Rebs sit at the moment. I think, but from the Pokes side, you have a bye week. You're relatively healthy. They've lost a few players to season enders. I mean, that's just bound to happen. But they played two tough non-conference teams, and to come out with only a couple injuries and most of your core is intact. I mean, that's incredibly important, and it's going to put them on the right foot. I mean, obviously the goal, it's conference season, right? Same thing in high school. All of these games are way more important than the non-conference games. Now is your time to make a stand, and if the Pokes want to start off right, they got to win this game.
Well, in that game, of course, tomorrow at 5 o'clock, you can listen live here on 99.1 KWYW on one of our networks. Of course, television, if you'd rather go with that, I prefer to actually have the TV on and the radio guys on, but that's become increasingly harder to time, unlike back in the old days, and get them somewhat close to each other. But it will be on CBS Sports Network. Now we're going to our pick'ems. All right, so last week...
Hey, who lost the surprise game last week?
I did, and Baylor did. But Baylor goes 3-3 on the week since we had 6 games. Cody goes 3-3, and I go 4-2 for the season standings of Baylor back at 500 again. At 13-13, Cody been falling a bit, down to 14-12, and of course me, 18-8. So
never pick the underdog, Kevin. That should be nickname.
Well, the funniest part is I don't know why. I have no idea why I picked USC over Illinois. Well, I kind of do now. I think about it. But the KC Ravens game was a big differential for us, as was Baylor going with TCU. But and then Cody's big one, the Penn State loss to Oregon.
I thought it was picking Alabama.
Yeah, well, it's James Franklin doing James Franklin things again.
He does not look very good.
No, he's like 0-16 against top Sixers. So. We'll jump right into it because I know we're running out of time here, and Leanne's upstairs board hopping for us and wants to get back downstairs. So we're going to start out with Boise State traveling to South Bend, Indiana for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish.
I think it's got to be Notre Dame.
Notre Dame.
And I'm going with the Irish too because the Irish cannot afford a loss. They lose this one. Season for them, especially not with any conference title kind of available to them. Season's done.
Boise's the leader of the Pack Stabbers too, so you can't root for Boise.
Then we got where game day is going to be. It would probably be more fun if it was in Nashville for them. But you've got Vanderbilt traveling to Tuscaloosa in Alabama. Baylor.
Oh boy. Vandy upset Bama last year. Obviously, that was a big game. Vandy's 5-0 too. Yeah,
they're good.
I think I just got to go to Bama. Things will return to normal, I think.
Roll Tide.
Okay, so we're all going to agree on that one too. I just think
you're picking Alabama.
Oh yeah, Bama's going to come in focused into this game. There would be the thought that they could be a little punch drunk, happy for last week, but they know what happened last year. And Vandy, unlike Oklahoma last year, Vandy didn't put them away, so to speak. Vandy they just couldn't stop Vandy, but Alabama pretty much answered the bell every time until time ran out.
I have a hard time believing that anybody in Georgia picks Alabama in any game.
Here's the funny part. Everybody across the country thinks Bama's a huge rival. They're not. And for us, for Bama fans, Georgia's not a huge rival because we don't play each other all that often, except for if it's for SEC titles or a national
who's your
title.
rival? Atlanta Falcons?
Well, it's the two SEC rivals are the two of the three that we kept. SEC came out with these are the three teams you'll play every year as we go to 9 teams. Auburn is the longest continuous rivalry in the country. We've played more times in a row than anybody else, and they're 60 minutes away from the Georgia line. So historically, it's huge. We've also cost each other. Yes. The two teams have also cost each other the most SEC titles if you go back all the way to the beginning. And then, of course, Florida, the world's largest outdoor cocktail party.
We're running out of time.
Yeah, huh?
The world's largest cocktail party. That's funny.
Yes, it's in Jacksonville, Florida. A battle of two teams that are kind of surprising each other, surprising people this year. The University of Virginia versus Louisville.
Who's home in that one? Do you know? I feel like Louisville is.
Harrison Whaley transferred to Virginia from Wyoming in the offseason. He's been getting anywhere from 2 to 3 carries per game. I'm going to go with the Cavs in this game. They're doing good things in Virginia.
I think I'm also leaning Virginia, I think.
I'm going. The one thing that bailed me out with Casey last week, I'm going with the home team. It is Louisville, and I think Virginia might be just a little bit too overjoyed with beating FSU last week. So I'm going to go with Louisville here. So we at least differ on that. Another matchup that kind of surprises people, the only NFL matchup that features two teams with a winning record, both of them 3-1, the Bucks versus the Seahawks. Cody.
I'm a Baker Mayfield guy, so I'm going Bucks. You know, they did lose Bucky Irvin, however, but it just so happens I picked up their next running back, White, so for fantasy. So it'll be the Bucks rolling the Seahawks.
I think the Seahawks are at home in that game, if I remember correct. Yeah, they are. I mean, that's about as far of a plane ride as you can get from Tampa Bay to Seattle. So, you know, Seattle's impressed this year. I think their defense is pretty good, and I think they topple the Bucks in this one.
And I am with Baylor. I'm going with the home team, the Seattle Seahawks.
Chickens.
And finally, a surprise team as far as being 2-2 on Monday night, going to a team that's surprisingly at 3-1. It is Kansas City Chiefs traveling to the Jacksonville Jaguars.
I like the Jaguars in this game because they're the home team, so I take the home team. And two,
when in doubt,
the Jaguars team's got it going. They're playing good football.
I think the Jags defense has proved to be a little bit better than what the Baltimore defense has done the last couple games. So I think I also am leaning the Jags as well.
Do it, Kevin. Do it.
I think this is a statement game for the Jags if they can get it. I think KC is kind of starting to not have the same pieces, especially in the trenches, and it's starting to catch up with them. I'm going with the Jags as well.
Xavier Worthy's back.
So
I was talking to a Kansas City fan last night, and they said they're rebuilding. So take that for what it's worth.
Take that for what's worth. Well, we've had it's been a great football season so far. Plenty left, although it goes by in a blink of an eye. Of course, tonight you guys have Buffalo. That will be about 5:30 Hampton and Suites pregame show. It is homecoming, so hopefully you guys will announce at least who wins homecoming king and queen. Although that's technically I think been announced already.
It has been announced.
I thought
pictures on WyoToday.
I thought I saw the pictures last night scrolling through. Hopefully the king and queen can both be there tonight. It was kind of interesting because the king for Shoshone, he was at work at Fastlane when he won it, so he was unable to be there
because she's in the band.
And so I saw that like hunters on the court and all that jazz. We didn't do that in my high school, so I don't quite understand it fully.
In
I understand
Riverton,
the king
they do
and
it by
queen part.
clubs, so clubs nominate. And Hunter Saltz gave her second attendant on the boys' side.
Yeah, I have no idea what all that means.
He took third
But
in the vote.
Okay, so 5:30 tonight, Hampton and Suites pregame show. Lander Valley has Douglas, thank you.
That's a big game.
That's Douglas at Lander as well.
Yeah, I've been writing articles on more.
Douglas is going to be upset.
So Landers at Douglas.
It was Lander. I thought
it was
Douglas
at Lander.
was Lander.
It's
Yeah.
at Lander, excuse me.
And
Lander
who is
hosts
tougher,
Douglas.
a Bearcat or a Tiger?
Oh,
You even know what a Bearcat is?
I'm going with the guy I saw on Joe Rogan once. Who was they threw quick at him, this or this. What would kill you faster? And once they got to Tiger, he never got off of it until they got to polar bear. So
Tiger's one of the two cats that will actually hunt a human being and eat it.
So I'm going with Tiger. But that game tonight at 7, it got moved. Evidently, we've been trying to lay eyes
on the WyoToday post.
Oh, I did. I did
Okay.
yesterday. A fan caught it. Some of the more statewide sites, Wyo Prep still has it at 6, but the FCSD 1 site has it at 7. So that's
Might
what we're
wanna
going to go
check on that.
So we're going to go with what the school has. And several parents were reaching out saying, "Hey, it's 7 o'clock." So
Okay.
about 6:30 with Ernie and Andrew on 931 KFCW. Of course, 1:30 will be the pregame show. 2 o'clock as Cokeville number 5 hosts number 3 Thermopolis. Big test on the road for Thermopolis, and that will kick off at 2 o'clock with Kevin and Ryan here on 101.7 KDNO. And then the next time we'll have a game on 991 KWYWB, 2 o'clock next week on Friday, DuBois versus Encampment, followed by me tearing down a kit really fast and driving no more than the speed limit.
An hour.
But driving kind of fast to get down and set up at Ethity for Wyoming Indian hosting Shoshone. Guys, have a great call tonight. Go Big Red and go Pokes tomorrow. And for Baylor Bears and Cody Bears, this has been Kevin Shields. We'll see you next week on Fridays on WyoToday Sports Live here on 101.7 KDNO.